Ed here with the Digital Digest, and today I wanted to share a quick unboxing and first look at the Sony A7 Mark III. Now, this is a long-awaited piece of gear for me. It launched back on April 10th of this year, and I finally got mine today. Ordered it through B&H. I did not get this from Sony to review. I purchased this like many of the things on my channel, and this is an exciting piece of gear for just about everyone out there. Whether you're a professional photographer, a hobbyist, enthusiast, amateur, whatever class you put yourself into, this is a legitimate full-frame camera with a very comprehensive feature set that rivals basically Sony's top-of-the-line A9, which is a $4,500 camera. So more than twice the price of this piece of gear. Of course, it doesn't have all of the bells and whistles, but it has all of the important ones. And you certainly will not find any camera, especially mirrorless camera, or again, I'll reiterate, any camera at this price point with this much under the hood. So a 24.2 megapixel sensor inside this camera. You can see that we do have the autofocus as listed right here. I'll give you a nice close-up. Basically the same specs as that $4,500 A9. You have 693 points of phase detection on the sensor. So that's 93% approximately of the sensor is covered. Whereas the A7R Mark III, which I also own, love, and use, only has 399. So even though we're not getting the 20 frames per second, we're getting 10 frames per second in burst mode here, a mechanical shutter, you're getting all of the autofocus prowess, just not the speed. So very competent autofocus, one that should best, without question, the A7R Mark III, a much more expensive camera at $3,200 body alone. Of course, this is US dollars. In-body stabilization, you've got that 5-axis stabilization. The dual SD card slot, again, one is UHS 2, one is UHS 1. You have somewhat of a touch screen. You have touch to focus. You've got hybrid log gamma for the video profiles, a USB 3.1 port that is also known as Type-C, and Bluetooth for geotagging, silent shooting. Things do fall off a little bit there. Don't expect the same performance. Eye autofocus is still here. All the things you expect. UHD, video recording at 4K, which is no pixel binning here. 6K down sampled to 4K. So that's another thing that may be important to many of you. And I'm not going to really compare this too much in this video to the A7R Mark II. I will save that for a dedicated video. So paperwork out of the way, let's get right into this box. I gave you enough of an introduction. The EVF on here isn't up to the resolution standard of the A7R Mark III, but remember, this is a much less expensive camera. So we've got our strap. Try to just gut the box and get to the body last. Nice empty slot right there. I was not expecting that to be empty. I may pull the body out right now and just set it aside. And basically the body is identical. We are using the Type-Z battery now, which was launched alongside the A9, and that is a very good thing because as mentioned on the back of this box, the average is a little under 700 shots, which you have to take into account because the A7R Mark II, we were still working with the old gen battery, which, as trustworthy as it was, averaged around 340 shots. So you're basically doubling your battery life here. No included battery charger with this camera like you get with the A7R Mark III or the A9, so keep that in mind. But there is the FZ1000 battery, which again is critical if battery life is important to you. In fact, the A7 Mark III has the highest or most efficient battery rating of any of Sony's A7 cameras right now. And as you can see, they're just including a sync cable or charging cable to charge the battery on the actual body of the camera. Again, no dedicated charger. Do I think that's a big deal? No. You can inexpensively purchase a third-party dedicated charger or go ahead and pick up Sony's very own. there we have it. A little bit of dust right here on the top. Let's get that out of the way. The A7 Mark III has arrived. So it's really full frame for everyone is what I would say. And that's because its pricing includes Micro Four Thirds and APS-C rivals, or at least is close enough to those rivals, and yet it offers so much more in terms of professional grade build quality and features. And with the overabundance now of Sony glass that's out there, as well as the wave of third-party glass, and of course the ability to adapt legacy glass using adapters because of the 5-axis image stabilization, this is a still and video beast that I think hits the sweet spot for most photographers, whether you do events such as weddings, again, or are just a hobbyist. You really do have everything that you could possibly need, unless you need the extra resolution that the A7R Mark III has to offer, or the 20 frames per second that the A9 has to offer at the same megapixel count as the A7 III that we're looking at right here. So shutter button right here, you know, as it usually is now on the A7 line. You have C1, C2, your mode dial, exposure. You have dedicated jog dials that can be customized in both the thumb and index finger positioning. Basically, all of the niceties of the A7R Mark III and the A9 have come to the A7 Mark III. As I mentioned, one thing we're lacking is the resolution of that OLED EVF. I wish that the A7 Mark III had that higher res. I think it's 2.6 million as opposed to 3.6 million, and that does make a difference. Whether you think it does or it doesn't, I can tell you right now, I've been spoiled with that EVF on the A7R Mark III, and that's going to be something I will have to overlook. But if you have not been spoiled, and even if you have, if pricing is relevant, you have to take into account the performance of this camera. Of course, the video record button has been relocated from the horrid spot that Sony always kept it, which was basically under your thumb while shooting, which made no sense at all. We have our actual joystick for circumnavigating, or just navigating, excuse me, the menu system. Menu button, C3, your dial, select button, all self-explanatory. Here is your dual SD card slot. As I mentioned before, you are working with only one UHS 2 and one UHS 1. In terms of the buffer on this camera, another thing people are going to be curious about, pretty good. You're looking at, I believe, somewhere around 170 and change if you're in JPEG, and if you're RAW, I think it's in the 70s. That's very close to what the A7R Mark III does, which of course has a 42 megapixel sensor. So, you know, not twice, but close to twice the resolution, where I think you're looking at about in the 70s, both in JPEG and RAW on continuous shooting before that buffer is going to fill. Of course, your battery bay down here for that FZ1000. And that's the beauty, is that really if you want to have the pro grade features, you've got them here in this camera. You have the ergonomics of a pro grade camera. Weather sealing could be better from what I've read, but considering this is a $2,000 camera, I think that is a petty complaint, believe it or not. We have our microphone jack right there. I do wish Sony would have kept these a little bit more rubberized, all of these port covers, and that's part of the weather sealing I'm talking about. You've got your HDMI out right there, as well as your headphone jack for monitoring. And then last but not least, we have our Type-C and micro USB port there, which essentially you're looking at a Type-C port, which everyone was waiting for, and of course was introduced with this latest gen of full-frame cameras from Sony. You do not have the flash synchronization that is found with the A7R Mark III, so that's something to bear in mind. But you've got that multi-port, that's how you're going to charge, as well as use other things, such as a shutter release from Sony. There are different products, that's why it's called the multi-port and not just a charging port, but it is a traditional micro USB. So no quick charge capability here. It would be nice if that was possible, but I recommend picking up a dedicated charger. So that pretty much rounds out the A7 Mark III. What it all comes down to is that you're looking at, for the first time, a $2,000 full-frame camera that is, of course, mirrorless, that does have 5-axis image stabilization, that is going to get close to 700 shots on a single charge of that FZ1000 battery type right there. You also have, as I mentioned before, 4K UHD video with no pixel binning, and that's because it's 6K downsampled, as I mentioned earlier, to 4K. So that means you are not losing any quality. Now, if that's in 24p, if you switch over to 30p, that's 4K at 30p, then it will be downsampled from 5K. So bear that in mind, just something to be aware of. And on paper, originally I thought the A7 Mark III appeared to edge out the A7R Mark III in video, but I'll have to see in practical, real-world capability and use, because from what I've been reading, that may not be the case. But when it comes to bang for your buck, overall capability, both photographic, I mean, with the improvement, you're getting basically that A9 autofocus system, just the burst mode, of course, cut in half to 10, which is the same 10 frames per second you're getting with the A7R Mark III, but again, not with 93% of the sensor covered. That nearly 700 points of phase detection on the autofocus side on the sensor is killer. And that's what makes the A7 Mark III so impressive at $2,000 or a hair under $2,000 US dollars, is that you're getting that autofocus system, you're getting the ergonomics, you're getting basically almost every element of the A9 except for that extra burst. And of course, that ability to shoot in silent mode without a loss or degradation of image quality. That is something that is unique specifically only to the Sony A9. But otherwise, it checks just about every box the A9 has, except for the EVF quality, as I mentioned earlier. So an incredibly compelling camera. I think Sony has hit it out of the park with this. That's why I had to wait on back order, even with a pre-order. And right now, I'm pretty sure they're still looking at about a 3 to 4 week fulfillment process on new orders for this camera, and it'll likely remain that way because Sony does it right. They listen to customers, they collect feedback, and they make cutting-edge digital imaging products, and that's exactly what the A7 Mark III is. It's everything that you could possibly want at a price that you can actually afford. And that can't be said of the A7R Mark III or the A9, which are clearly dedicated and directed towards professional shooters or hobbyists and enthusiasts who have very deep pockets. The A7 Mark III is the full frame for the masses, and that's not a knock, it is a compliment, and it does beg to question, why bother anymore with APS-C or Micro Four Thirds options when you have everything at a very similar cost, but with the ergonomics and build quality and modernization of Sony's best tech in breed, really, with that A9 autofocus system. So a lot to like here. I'm obviously very happy to finally have it. Soon I'll have some more glass to test it on as well. That G zoom lens that has been both a blessing and a curse to Sony because of some production issues. But again, really excited to have the A7 Mark III on the table, get out there, start shooting with it, and see how much it does outperform the A7R Mark III when it comes to autofocus, even though they both, again, shoot 10 frames per second. How much more accurate, how many more keepers will I have with the A7 Mark III, even though I have, basically half of the resolution, and also no pixel shift technology and that downgraded EVF. But that covers everything. Any questions or comments, please feel free to post them. Hit that like button. And as usual, please feel free to subscribe. Later.